Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ryan. Hello and welcome to our live event tonight, in which we'll introduce you to the AAII Way. My name is John Bykowski. I'm president of the AAII, and I will serve as the moderator tonight. So please be sure to type in your questions and comments into the questions panel, and I'll do my best to relay those questions to our speaker tonight. Now, the American Association of Individual Investors is an independent nonprofit group that helps individuals become effective managers of their own assets through programs of education, information, and research. And really, the AAII Way really fits into that particular mold right now. We have a very special guest tonight, Charles Rotblut. Charles is the editor of the AAII Journal. He heads up the VMQ Stock Service, and he's even authored a book titled Better Good Than Lucky. But really lately, he's been very busy. He's been keeping himself busy developing and presenting a comprehensive system that individual investors like yourselves can use to assess your current financial position, document your investment profile, and develop a strategy to help meet your financial dreams. Welcome, Charles.
Good evening, John.
So before we begin tonight, perhaps you could tell our audience a little bit about the genesis of this current undertaking, which I know you call the AAII Way. Jokingly, I refer to it as the Individual Investor Manifesto.
Well, I certainly like the nickname. So this really came about from discussions inside the office about trying to give our members a systematic way of managing their investments. As you know, I'm very much into behavioral finance, and we realize we have a lot of information on the site, a lot of valuable information. But when we look to see what else could we do for our members, I think one of the things that you and I realized, and some other people in the office, is that one thing we can really give our members is a way to create their own investment policy statement, a guide to help them make the decisions throughout the whole process. And the whole idea is if they have a systematic approach, they'll be better able to make good decisions no matter what the market is doing.
That sounds great. Now, I know you've been working on this for some time, and really you've been devoting a number of your investor updates over the past few months, kind of get feedback from members. What's your hope as you're doing this?
Well, my hope is that members will ultimately use it. My hope is that members will find it to be very valuable. But it is interesting hearing the feedback. Some of it's very positive, and that's always reassuring to hear it. And sometimes we'll get people saying, have you done this, or have you considered that? And you have a lot of great ideas. I've got a lot of great ideas. Many of our colleagues have great ideas. But we also get close to things. And so it's always nice when you put something out into the world and you get feedback from members. And it's interesting to hear what they see, what they agree with. And occasionally they uncover some holes, or every once in a while, unfortunately, we do let a gaffe get outside the door, so we try to stop it. But we're always grateful that our members are that engaged that they do reach out to us with their comments.
Well, I know for a fact that you made a number of changes to some of these worksheets you've developed. So I'm looking forward to your presentation tonight, and I don't want to take away from your time. So I'm going to shut my webcam off here. I'm going to monitor the questions panel for questions. I guess you want to take questions a couple times. Maybe you'll do a couple breaks during the evening and try to get some answers to the questions that people have, and I'll be here waiting for those.
That sounds great. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to share my screen here and switch to the presentation. And so I'm going to talk to you today about our AAII Way, our method of helping you create a plan for managing your investments. And part of the process here is, as you'll see it really is about personalization. So we're going to give you all a framework that you can use. So it won't be a one-size-fits-all strategy, because everyone listening, everybody tuning in right now does have a different manner of investing, has different goals, different preferences. Sorry for my phone ringing there in the background. That's probably my mother-in-law. But I'll talk through this while the phone's going. So this is a new project that's really developed to help you all create, as I said, a comprehensive plan to managing your investments, really governing all the decisions that go into your investment strategy. And it really builds on some of the things we've done in the past. When you all first joined, you received our Lifetime Strategy for Investing, a great book written by our founder, Jim Cloonan. Some of you might have read the ebook, Investing Basics and Beyond. If you haven't read either of these, or if it's been a while, you can certainly find these on our website. They're great, still valuable resources, and we're really trying to build on their shoulders, really extend a lot of the concepts that were presented in both documents, as well as many other things we've produced over the years, over the more than 40 years that AAII has been in existence. And one of the things that we're really basing this on is the idea of really having a systematic approach. And our founder, Jim Cloonan's always been a big believer in systematic approaches. Those of you who have followed the shadow stock portfolio for years know that is a systematic portfolio. It's a quantitatively driven portfolio with very clear buy and sell rules. And even though Jim was a big believer in systematic investing, there wasn't as much research about doing it as there has been since AAII started. Now, we can't give Jim the credit. It's more coincidental, but there's been a ton of research and really a growing amount of new research showing that systematic approaches, rules-based approaches, help people make better decisions. And it can be rules, it can be checklists, it can be a process. It really doesn't matter what word you use, but the idea is that you have a way that you walk through every time to make those decisions, something that gets you to walk away from your emotions, walk away from your emotional tendencies to do certain things, and really stick to the rules. Because anytime you can really put your brain on hold, particularly your what's known as System 1, which is our reactive senses, really the type of system that we use to make most of our decisions, the more we can put that on hold, and the more we can have something that's unemotional and repeatable to focus on, the better the decisions we're going to make. And part of the reason why I'm starting off talking about this is that it's really easy to lose sight of what's important. As we talk now, we're hearing about spikes in coronavirus cases. My parents live in San Antonio. I have a lot of close friends in Houston. So I'm watching the numbers in Texas very closely. Certainly here in Chicago, we were a hot spot. Knock on wood, hopefully we won't go back to being a hot spot. But day to day, you're hearing about the coronavirus. Are more businesses going to shut down? Is the economy going to slow down? For the companies that have reopened, how quickly will they reopen? And so when you have all these headlines, it's really easy to focus on those headlines and not think about the bigger picture. And so whenever the market's gyrating a lot, I will occasionally have friends come up to me and say, well, what's going on with the market? What should I do? And I always smile at them and say, you know what? It really doesn't matter what's happening today, so long as on the day you retire, you have more in your account than you have now. Because really the big picture is, what are your goals? And will you have enough money at the time you need it to fund those goals? Everything else is really just noise. I know that's hard to take, particularly when you go back to March and the markets were dropping. But if you learn to take that longer term view, your head becomes clear, and really the investing process becomes a lot easier to do as well. Doesn't make you any less scared, doesn't keep you from having sleepless nights, but it will help you think about how you should be managing your investments. The other aspect, and the reason why I think a systematic approach is so important, is there's been a lot of new research into noise. And we typically think of noise as being cars honking, people yelling, maybe there's loud music. But noise in this sense, according to Daniel Kahneman, the first person to win a Nobel Prize for behavioral science, are things that affect our investing decisions that we don't think they should. For instance, there's been research suggesting the weather outside affects whether or not the market's going to be up or down, whether it's sunny or not. How long has it been since you've eaten? Are you tired? Are you fatigued? Did you get in a fight with your spouse before sitting down to make a decision? All these factors that shouldn't affect your decisions are being found to actually affect your decision process. And they're called noise because they're really external factors that are interfering with your decision process. So again, if you have this rules-based approach, you'll start to negate the effect that noise has on your decision making. And as I said, Jim Cloonan actually was a very big proponent of it. Several years ago in the AAII Journal, in one of his updates to the shadow stock, he wrote down 2 rules for investing success. Rule number 1 was developing a consistent, well-defined approach to investing. Rule number 2 was always stick to rule number 1. And so this process we're developing is really tied to those rules about helping you develop your own approach to how you should manage your portfolios. And as I go through some of the examples today and talk to you about some of the things behind the process, realize that ultimately your goal is to figure out what is this optimal strategy. And those of you who have seen me present before have seen this slide because I use it often. And the idea is that the optimal strategy is always the one you can follow. And it's different for every person. We'll give you an idea of how to assess your risk, but you can fill out this risk tolerance spreadsheet, which I'll show you in a little bit, and realize that's really not what I can follow. And that's okay. Each person has a different tolerance for risk, a different tolerance for volatility, and has different preferences about how much they want to be involved in the investing processes. That's why I'm saying we're going to give you a framework. We're going to give you the tools for you to decide what's best for you, because there is no single strategy that works best for every person watching this webinar. And so what will the AAII Way encompass? We've been talking a lot, really not into a lot of details. So what we're going for is a series of worksheets, and we've been unveiling these at AAII.com/AAII Way. You can actually go to this URL, see what we've developed so far, and again, check in on a weekly basis, and you can see the progress we're making on the project. I've been using my weekly investor update, AAII.com/investor-update, as John mentioned earlier, to talk about some of the things that are developing, to flesh out some of the theories and some of the thoughts behind the worksheets we're developing. I've been doing that in my weekly investor updates. We're also publishing revised worksheets in the AAII Journal, the investor graphic, the July AAII Journal, which is now available on AAII.com, has one of those worksheets. Longer term, we're going to integrate this into the website. So our goal is to actually release pretty well finished draft versions so you all can take a look at it, give us your feedback before we do a lot of the hard programming. But our ultimate goal is to actually have this be programmed into AI, have this coexist with our other tools, so it's all one comprehensive resource, and possibly a new book, possibly a second book by me. So what is this process? Well, some of you might have seen this. We published this in last month's AAII Journal. It's a 5-step process for building your wealth. And you can see the chart on my screen. I'll walk you through it in more simple terms. It's really about identifying who you are as an investor and why is money important. Why are you investing? Why are you saving? What do you hope to do with the money? And then once you identify your goals, your profile, your time horizon, then you can start picking the appropriate allocation. And I've had some people say, well, why are you picking allocations so early in the process? And the idea is, if you have a certain goal, you know how far away it is, and you know what your risk tolerance is, that should govern how you invest. So if you think about it, if you're in New York and you want to get to LA, you shouldn't really be planning what hotels you're going to stop at first. You should really be thinking about, how am I going to get there? If you need to be in LA that evening, you're not going to get there by driving. You're going to need to find a plane flight. If you want to sightsee, well, then maybe you want to drive. So allocation is the same thing. If you need to buy a car, say you want to buy Tesla or Mercedes, or perhaps you have your eyes on a really nice Toyota SUV, and you plan to buy it within 3 years. Well, you shouldn't have your money in the stock market. You should be thinking about, how am I going to allocate it to cash, and then figure the best way to what type of cash savings account is appropriate for you. After that, then we start getting into the level of involvement you want in your portfolio. Maybe you're the person who loves to adjust the dials and you love to roll up your sleeves and get into the financial analysis. That's great. Maybe you're someone who wants to work with an advisor or hire a fund manager. That's good too. But decide that before you start thinking about how you're going to invest, because only after you've made those decisions, then can you start getting into nitty-gritty about what type of investment should I actually hold. And once you've done all that, then it's just a matter of running the process, periodically reviewing your process, reviewing your portfolio. Does it still match what you need it to match? Have your goals changed? Do you need to do some things in terms of estate planning? Going through that review process. So it really starts from the top as to who am I as an investor and why am I investing? And it goes all the way down to this review process where you ask yourself, do I just need to review my investments? Or has something major changed in my life that I need to reevaluate my goals and the type of investor I am? So that's a process right there. And it's based on a simple process. It's based on a simple premise. Who are you as an investor? What strategy is appropriate for you? And what do you need to review and what do you need to adjust as necessary? Now, that's a lot of stuff in there, and there's a lot of details that go behind this chart. So this is the overview. And I want to point out that this is just the overview. And as we build out this process, there's going to be a lot of details behind it. We're going to plug in those details and help you plug in the details and answer the questions to make this work for you. I do want to point out that this plan can be as simple or as complex as you need it to be. Again, we're not creating a one-size-fits-all. We're giving you a framework. And some of you may just want to know enough and do enough that you can sit down with your advisor and say, these are the goals I want to reach. This is the type of tolerance I have. I need you to execute it. And if we just get you to the point where you can go to an advisor and say, here's my plan, will you execute it? To give you that ability to walk in an advisor's office, and if they hem and haw, you can grab that sheet of paper and walk out and say, you're not the advisor for me. If that's all you need it for, that's great. That'll help you immensely. If you're the type of person that, you know what, I really want to use Stock Investor Pro, I really want to use the stock screens on A+ to really dig in and pick my own investments, and I just need a method for giving me more discipline and doing it, you can use this as well. If you're somewhere in between and you're looking to, say, use index funds or mutual funds, that's fine. Again, we want you to take this and cater it to your own style of investing. So depending on what you need, you can adjust this to fit your goals. And before I go on to explain about how it defines your goal, John, I'm going to stop for a second and ask you, have there been any questions so far that I need to address?
Well, you've actually perhaps addressed them already. There were two questions that came up. First of all, I had a question here from Nate Watson, and this probably just comes to the point you just had here. So he's new, fairly new to investing. He's using his AAII membership to broaden his knowledge base regarding individual stocks before really shifting from funds to stocks. So will the AAII way help him, or is it really geared towards stocks?
It will help them, and that's the idea. Is where it's not just geared towards stocks; it's actually geared to all types of investors. So we're going to actually talk to people how to pick stocks, but also how to pick funds. So it's actually, we're designed to gear to a wide range of investors because we know no two AAII members are the same. We have some that really, like I said before, some that really want to pick their own investments, but we also know about 30% of AAII members work with an advisor. So we're really trying to cast a wide net and have this really be flexible enough to work with a wide variety of investors.
And I've got a suggestion here from from Jim here, and he thinks the coaching element of this process would be very helpful, and it could provide some feedback back to you and also to people that are mentors. So he encourages us to try to set up a mentoring system for the process.
That's great.
And let's see here. Also, one question here, how do you control your emotions, especially during such a volatile market like we have today?
It's really tough. One of the things I do is I just keep written rules about what I'm going to do and follow that. But the other thing I would tell people that if you get nervous, shut everything off. Stop watching the news and start really engaging in something that makes you happy. But I make a lot of references to dieting, partially because I've lost a lot of weight. But in dieting, they talk about triggers, and trigger is something that prompts you to eat. Because a lot of people, they get emotional and they eat. And if you can figure out what causes you to react, say for instance, what's going to cause you to sell something in your portfolio, and then just figure out something that'll break that. So for instance, maybe you have a rule before you make any investments, you go into your browser, you put it in there, and then you walk away from your computer for an hour. Maybe you just stop and breathe. Anything you can do to just break that automatic reaction can help. And now different things work for different people. And for some people, just having that rules they can fall back on really helps. For some people, they need a break. For other people, what you could do is maybe segment a certain portion of your portfolio. And this is the portion I'm going to allow myself when I get worried to pull back on. And you leave the rest of your portfolio invested. So it gives you the ability to channel your emotions somewhat without pulling your whole portfolio out of the market. And there's not one thing that works for every person, but those type of things can actually work very effectively.
So I've got two more questions. I'll let you continue on with your presentation here.
Sure.
Roger here is a young 66 and wants to make sure that the information here is pertinent to him.
Absolutely. And in fact, in the specs we have on this, we're going to talk about retirement withdrawals. We'll probably at some point address transitioning. But I also near the end want to include some stuff about estate planning and even final wishes, because I think those type of things, how you want your investments, if you're passing on to your heirs, about how you want those managed. So I think it doesn't matter if you're someone who's just starting out and maybe you're a teenager or maybe you're just out of school, to say you're 80s or 90s. We're actually making it with that wide range of people in mind. So, certainly a lot of members are the same age as this gentleman, and so we're definitely keeping that in mind as we build this out.
And then one last question here before we continue. So if you're working with an advisor, doesn't it make, why would you create an asset allocation first before reaching out to an advisor? What are your thoughts there?
Well, my thoughts is the reason why you do it is so if the advisor's giving you suggestions, you actually know whether or not it makes sense to you. And I'm going to go back to a book I read back in high school, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And somewhere in the book, the author made an analogy that even if you never want to fix a motorcycle, if you know how to do it, you can at least explain to a mechanic what's wrong with your bike. And it's the same thing with investing. If you go through the process of determining what an appropriate allocation is for you, and then when you go to an advisor and the advisor suggests you should do X, Y, and Z, you at least know that that meshes with what I've decided for myself. Or if you realize that's different than what I thought I should have, it gives you the ability to have a conversation with the advisor saying, well, that's not what I thought I should have. Why are you suggesting this? Or why do you think I'm wrong? And again, a good advisor will sit down and have that conversation with you. If the advisor's pretty headstrong and he starts telling you flat out you're wrong, that's a sign it's not the right advisor for you. Because there's a lot of advisors out there, but advisors, ultimately, their value is as coaches. And not every advisor is right for every investor. So it gives you the ability to not only appraise the advisor, but also gives you the ability to really have a more meaningful conversation with the advisor, particularly if it's an advisor who's at one of the better ones.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to let you continue on with your presentation, but I want to just remind our audience out there that a couple questions have come up, that we are recording this session and an email will go out tomorrow along with the presentation handout slides. So they'll get access to both the slides and the video, and that'll be available to them tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to shut my webcam off and let you keep going on. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, John. So now we're going to get into really the first step about defining who you are, because regardless of the type of investor you are, the whole process really starts with who you are as an investor. And as I said before, why is money important to you? A phrase I'm stealing from Carl Richards. And the idea about who you are really comes down to starting off with our first worksheet, which is really assessing your goals. Because all of us are investing, and we're investing for a reason. Yes, we might enjoy doing it. Some of us get a lot of pleasure about really digging into the nuances of various securities. But ultimately, we're investing for something. For instance, my primary goal is making sure my wife and I can live a comfortable retirement. So that's my primary goal. For people listening, your goal might be funding retirement. It might be leaving money to your heirs, perhaps helping a child or grandchild out with college. Maybe you have a goal if you want to leave money for a charity or your congregation. And I'm guessing many of you, like me, probably have different goals. And so what we want to do with this is have you actually write those goals down, make them more tangible, and then prioritize them. Because while it's always nice to have unlimited amounts of money, the reality is most of us have a finite level of money. And so while you might have 5 goals and they might all be very worthy goals, if you had to pick and choose which goal should come first. And so the idea is list those goals, consider the timing. How far away is that goal? So for instance, we just had a question for a gentleman who's 66. Retirement might be right now for him, might be 4 years from now. The idea of listing how far away that goal is, it really is how soon do you need to start spending cash on that goal? And then spending duration is how long is that goal going to be? For retirement, somebody retiring at age 65, they could be looking at 20, 30, possibly even more. A short-term goal, for instance, like John knows, my colleagues have been laughing at me about I need to replace my home office chair. I'm realizing mine is well worn out. And so that spending is immediate. But for instance, say you had a car, maybe your car is 10, 12 years old, and at some point the transmission is going to go. Well, that might be a goal that you need to spend in about 2 or 3 years. Cars, and presume cars are expensive, and you want to make sure you have that in cash. So the idea of listing, and that would also be a lump sum payment. Even if you make a down payment, you have a loan on it, or you're buying a house, and you're making a down payment and you're going to pay off the rest of the mortgage, you still have that short-term outlay. So your spending duration would be very short for that. So you don't have to put into it. The comment section actually came from one AAII member. So when we said about getting feedback and incorporating that feedback, that's something you could use. You can list how much that goal is going to be. Maybe you could say, if my portfolio hits X level, I'm going to buy that nice Mercedes at X Tesla. I'm going to go travel to Europe when it's finally safe to do so. Whatever you see fit. Again, try to make those goals more tangible to you. So why are we having you do this exercise? Well, one, again, if you write down the goal, it makes it more concrete. And I used to race bikes. I used to be a competitive cyclist, and I remember hearing one time a coach saying, if you have a goal you want to reach, write it down. In fact, tell everybody about your goal, because that makes the goal more tangible in your mind, and it gives you more impetus to actually reach that goal. But also it makes you think about, why is money important? And if you understand why money is really important, it actually starts getting down to your spending decisions. If your goal is to buy a second home, and you're looking at this nice couch, you might think to yourself, yeah, it's a really nice couch I'm seeing in the window, but what would be nicer is having that second home. Maybe it's in Santa Barbara, maybe it's in Aspen, maybe it's in the Ozarks. I know everybody has different preferences, but it kind of gets you to start prioritizing money. It gets you to start thinking about, where do I want to allocate my money to? But it also helps you define your time horizon. How far away is that goal? And once that goal is reached, how long do I need to plan on spending on it? So that gets down to your allocation. Because if you know when that goal is going to be reached and how long you're going to be spending on that goal, it starts influencing the type of allocation decisions you're going to make and also the type of investments you're going to hold. And again, it helps you prioritize. You start writing down your goals, you might start thinking, this would be nice, but I really have to do this. So let's give you an example, because I think if I give you an example, it might make things a little bit more tangible. So I'm using an example here of Bob and Jane. They've recently retired, and they're pretty fortunate. Not only are they getting Social Security, but they're also getting pensions. They also pretty affluent. They have $1.5 million in savings. They have kids and grandkids. So right off the bat, we know that Bob and Jane are affluent and they have a lot of guaranteed cash flow. Now, because they're recently retired, their goal number one is funding retirement. They both stopped working. They're out of their careers, but they do need to put food on the table. They need to cover their insurance, drugs, and obviously they want to do things. So they need to rely on income to do that. That's not from their salaries. Now for them, fortunately, because they have the pension, they have Social Security, it's covering their living expenses. So their first goal is paying for retirement, which is a top priority. As a spending duration, we're going to say they're healthy, they got good genetics, and they can live into their mid-90s. So their spending duration is 30 years. Now realize they're retired, and we really do not know what their spending duration is going to be. For those of you trying to figure out how long do you plug in retirement, one thing I would point out is that there's a lot of studies show that people underestimate how long their lifespans are. In the world of finance, longevity is a risk. Now, I don't know anybody who wouldn't want more years of quality life. But from a financial standpoint, more years of quality life also means more years of spending, which means you need more income, more wealth to cover that spending. So it's viewed as a risk. So you might want to think about the possibility that you could live longer than expected when plugging in a spending duration. It is our top priority. But in the comment section, they wrote, yes, it's our top priority, but we're fortunate to have our Social Security and our pension benefits covering it. Now, their next goals are to help their two grandkids with college. Now, different ages. One's going to approach college in 8 years. The other's going to approach college in 12 years. So they're writing that down. So different spending durations for when those goals are going to be hit. Now, they're both assuming their kids are going to get through college in 4 years. And we have a totally separate discussion about whether 4 years is realistic or not, but we're plugging it in. So they know at what point the goal is going to be reached, but then they also know there's a small tail. So the goal is going to hit at 8 years and 12 years, but then there's a spending period after that goal is reached. So it's not a single lump sum, but over a short period of time. And then they'd like to leave an inheritance. And hopefully they can do all of those. They may not be able to, so they realize that push comes to shove, they'd rather help out with their grandkids' college expenses than leave an inheritance. Now, somebody else might have completely different goals, and that's fine, but at least it allows them to prioritize. And you'll see in the comment sections, one of the things that Bob and Jane write is that for the inheritance is to invest it aggressively. The idea being that if their heirs aren't going to see the money until they pass, then they should really focus on growth and really try to maximize their growth. Now, even with the new inherited IRA rules, it's still 10 years before the heirs have to take the money. So theoretically, it could be till Bob and Jane pass, plus an additional 10 years. And so when you start factoring their possible lifespan plus those 10 years, being very aggressive with those assets makes sense. And they could even put a note, segment a portion of our portfolio solely for inheritance, and it's invested aggressively. And for those of you who are able to do that, where you know you have more than enough money to cover your living expenses and other short-term goals, that is one process you can do, is actually manage that portion of your portfolio separate from other portions of your portfolio. It does make the allocation process a little more complicated, but it's one thing you can think about as you go through this process. Do you want to actually start segmenting your portfolio and managing according to your goals? It gives you a lot more flexibility to do certain things, but it is a layer of complexity. And again, you have to decide how comfortable you are with taking that level of complexity. Now, let's take this a step further. Let's talk about their tolerance for risk. And so why are we doing this? So we just talked about the goals, so why are we now jumping to the risk tolerance? Well, again, it has to do with the timing of when you need the money. If you need the money in 5 years, it's a completely different tolerance for risk than if you need the money in 20 or 30 years. And then also, what happens once your goal is reached? If your goal is retirement, and say you're 30 years old, you get to retirement, well, you know that's another 35 years away. And then you know once you retire, you're going to have a long tail afterwards of spending. So that's a different time horizon than if you know, I want to hit this goal on X date and I've got to spend a lump sum at that point. But you also want to think about your wealth, because how much are you spending relative to your wealth? Everybody listening has a different level of wealth. And although your goal might require spending immediately, it may be a small percentage relative to your wealth. So that does influence the type of decisions you can make. If it's a large percentage of your wealth, that also influences the decisions you'll make. And finally, you want to consider your emotional tolerance, because we can make a financial argument as to why you should be allocated almost solely to stocks if you have a long time horizon. But if you're the type of person, whenever the market takes a downturn, as it did earlier this year or as it did in 2008, if you're the type of person who gets really nervous and has a lot of sleepless nights, then a portfolio that's fully stocks may not be appropriate for you. And again, there's no right or wrong answer to this. This is really about knowing who you are and catering your investment decisions to that. So let's go back to our hypothetical stick figure couple of Bob and Jane. What do we know about them? Well, based on what I've told you so far, we know they're affluent. They have a lot of savings. They also have a pension and Social Security. So they're very fortunate to have their living expenses covered with guaranteed income, meaning that no matter what happens to the portfolio, as long as the pension's there and they're receiving their Social Security, their living expenses are covered. The other thing is, we know their primary goal is funding retirement, and because they're recently retired, we know the timing of that goal is now. But we're also assuming they're in good health and they could have a long lifespan. So the duration of the goal is now with this long tail for spending. So based on this, we can actually have them fill out a risk tolerance spreadsheet. And you'll see here, there's actually blank versions of this available on AAII if you want to fill these out yourselves. But let's walk through this, and I'll walk you through some of the reasons why we have these specific questions. So first of all, again, how far away is the goal? What is your time horizon before the goal is reached? Now, we could say, now for Bob and Jay, we're saying it's now in the short term because they just recently retired. If they were young, we might pick something different. Now, what's the time period they're going to spend on this goal? Well, I just said we're going to forecast they're going to make it into their 90s. Is it possible they're in good health? Absolutely. Do we know for sure? No. It's possible they could pass sooner than expected. But again, when you're trying to forecast longevity, you're always better erring on you living longer than expected. And again, hopefully that longer life comes with quality as well. Now, what about their wealth? How much are they going to spend relative to their wealth? Well, we know A, Bob and Jane are really affluent. They have big savings, but B, because they have this pension and because they have the Social Security, they're going to spend a little of their wealth on retirements. Now, they might incur RMDs, which means they would have to pay the taxes on taking those required minimum distributions. But if they didn't need to spend that money, they could turn around and invest it, and all they'd really be out of pocket is a tax bite, which again is not pleasurable, but a small percentage relative to their overall wealth. So based on these factors, we're assessing them as actually having a high level of tolerance. We're listing as actually having a long-term timing risk, because over the short term, they really need to spend a small amount of their total wealth on funding their primary goal. Now, again, they would do this on the other goals as well. Now, let's add a little bit more about Bob and Jane. We're going to assume they've been fairly disciplined, but they have reduced their exposure to equities a little bit. So they've been pretty good about sticking to their plan, but when the markets have taken downturns, they've gotten a little bit nervous and they've pulled back a little bit on their allocation to equities, as a lot of people do. But we also know their large amount of cash flow provides a buffer against market volatility. If the market tanks tomorrow or next year, the retirement plans aren't going to be wrecked. They have the ability to withstand that. We're also going to say that they understand investing concepts, but they don't consider themselves experts. So why am I saying this? The reason I'm saying this is if you understand the markets, you understand market history, you're going to be better positioned to withstand market volatility. If you understand what the market has done historically, that it does drop and it does come back, when you see things happen, you're going to realize this is more normal. And in fact, there's been some studies showing that as people get more and more used to bull and bear markets, they tend to react less to them. Now, do they stop reacting? Absolutely not. For those of you familiar with the story of Isaac Newton, got involved in the shipping craze, the seas. I'm drawing a blank on the company name. Bought early into a bubble, sold halfway through, and then near the peak of the bubble, got in again and lost all his money. They've done studies that people experience these manias. They make the mistake of getting involved in a mania first. Then you start realizing they stop getting out of it, but there's still that little peak that they ultimately give into the temptations. But it does show that as people gain experience, they do tend to react less to the markets. So when you're less experienced, less knowledgeable, you tend to be more reactive. And as you gain more and more experience, you tend to be less reactive. So that's our rationale for including it in the spreadsheet. But let's walk through Bob and Jane here. So we've said they've reduced their exposure to stocks during past downturns. So we're going to mark that down in terms of market declines. How have you reacted? Now, I want to point out, we didn't ask how you would react to a drop in the markets. We asked what have you done in the past? And a lot of advisors, when they give you a risk tolerance, you might see statements on there. If you're investing in an investment and it were to lose 25 or 30% of your investment, how would you feel? Questions along those lines are commonly asked. And there's a problem with those. If I were to give you that question, say in October of last year, and the market was doing pretty well, if I gave it to you, I think it was like 2017, which was a very calm market. If I give it to you then, your question would be really different than I gave you that question last March, right before the market bottomed. So when people ask you to assess how you would react to a drop in the markets, that's where that concept of noise comes into play. Because how you're feeling that day is going to determine how you answer that question. So we instead want you to go back and look at your financial statements. And in fact, start keeping a diary when you do find yourself reacting to what the market's doing, but how you react. Because that's really more telling about what you're going to do in the future. And so we think it's more important to consider what you've done in the past versus what one questionnaire says, how would you react to this scenario? Because your reaction to that scenario will literally change from month to month, season to season, and perhaps even day to day. So the next thing is, how much of your spending needs are covered by non-portfolio income? Well, we just said that Bob and Jane are fortunate, so they don't need to spend much of their portfolio on the retirement expenses. So this really is a matter of risk. If your portfolio were to drop in value, how much would it impact your plans? How badly would it alter your plans? In the case of Bob and Jane, they're fortunate that their expenses are all covered by non-portfolio income, which is huge. And their knowledge of key investing concepts, again, really gets to how they're going to react. So we give them to a moderate. So in this case, we list our financial and psychological tolerance as being high. Now it's the bottom end of being high, but the reason why it's high is because of their wealth and because of their high level of cash flow. Now, based on this, we can actually assign to a grid. Basically, we're charting their timing risk, when they need to spend the money in house, whether it's a lump sum or not, and their financial and psychological tolerance. And based on this, we can assign a grid to these people. So in this case, for Bob and Jane, we're saying they have the ability to be aggressive. And what you see here in this bottom box where it says very conservative to aggressive, this actually is going to tie into our allocation models. We do have these models available on AAII right now, and we're going to tweak them. You're going to see me talking about bonds in tomorrow's investor update, and probably the week afterwards, we're actually going to talk about how are some of the changes we're making to our asset allocation models and how they actually fit into this. But the aggressive allocation really means you're almost fully allocated to stocks. For those of you who have read Jim Cloonan's Level 3, he talked about an all-stock portfolio and with a small amount allocated to cash to cover spending needs. That's essentially our aggressive allocation model. The very conservative really means you're in cash. And if you read our lifetime strategy to investing, we do talk about a pre-stage about building up your savings. So if you need to spend all your money immediately, you're really in that very conservative range. In between are varying levels of allocations to stocks, bonds, and cash. And so this scenario, we're saying Bob and Jane should be aggressive because their grandkids still have a ways to go before college. There are obviously inheritances are far away, far off in the future, hopefully for them. And for the short-term goal, it's already covered. And so right here, you can see this in the worksheet. I'm not going to read through all these, but we actually give the definitions behind each of these risk tolerances to try and make them a little bit more tangible, at least in our view, what we think they mean. And I encourage you to read through them. So again, we assume that Bob and Jane should have this aggressive risk tolerance. And again, it's because of their lack of cash flow. But let's take a twist on this. What if Bob and Jane weren't so fortunate? What if they didn't have that pension? A lot of retirees don't have pensions now. A lot of people in my generation never had a pension. So what would change about the risk tolerance? Well, the sequence of returns would matter a lot more. They'd have much greater timing risk. Sequence of returns is basically the type of market returns you see throughout your lifetime. So someone, say, who had retired in 1993 would have had a very different experience in terms of retiring. They retired into a bull market, which is great, than the person that retired, say, at the end of 2007. Or say someone who retired at the beginning of this year only to find that coronavirus hits. And when we get later to this process, we start talking about retirement withdrawals, we're going to hit on this. My experience with looking at withdrawal rates when I've run models is that if you have a bear market early in your retirement, it has a very damaging effect on your ability to fund your the very negative effect on your ability to fund retirement throughout your entire lifetime. In fact, if you have a bear market early retirement, the more you can tighten your belt during that bear market and avoid withdrawing from your portfolio, the higher chance of success is going to be. And so that's why this really affects their timing risk. But the other thing is, if they don't have that pension to rely on, psychologically, they might feel more nervous about market downturns. They might worry more about what the downturn is going to have on their portfolio. And so without this high level of cash flow, they might prefer a more moderate allocation of 60% stocks, 40% bonds and cash. And I'll address bonds in the current yield environment a little bit in tomorrow's investor update. But the big thing to realize here, the reason why we're suggesting bonds in this current yield environment is that bonds tend to be uncorrelated with stocks. They have an element of cash flow to them. And even though yields are so low, because they're less volatile, they can make it easier to invest in stocks. For those of you who read Jim Cloonan's level 3 approach, he talked about having a cash bucket, a very conservative bucket. This is basically the same thing where you still have a portion of your portfolio allocated to growth, but you've got a bigger cushion to deal with that market volatility. Now, before I get into preferences, John, have there been any questions about these first two worksheets that I need to address before moving on with the other aspects of the AI way?
Well, there's a lot of questions that have come up, Charles, and whether they're specifically tied to the worksheet or not is obviously for discussion here. But like, for example, how do you account for non-portfolio risk, such as the likelihood of Social Security being cut or a pension fund being reduced or even an insurance company going under? How does that factor into the risk of the assessment?
Well, I think that's something when you look at your risk, you want to build that into it. And if you think there's a chance of that actually affect, it's really it comes out of a financial risk. And if you think there's a chance that you might at some point have to spend more of your wealth, that's where you want to start factoring in. Now, I will point out Social Security. If nothing's done, benefits will be reduced by about 26, 27%. The number changes each year, but it's not going to go away. But it's something you can actually build into how much you're going to spend relative to your wealth. And it may be a case that if you're worried about one of those things happening, it could be an argument for adapting a little bit more conservative allocation to as a buffer against one of those risks actually occurring.
A lot of members are concerned about Bob and Jane's health insurance and insurance needs in retirement. Two of the biggest kickers that are in this question is coming up with a number of readers. Two of the biggest hits potentially in retirement are healthcare costs, as well as the loss of purchasing power through inflation. How is that accounted for?
Sure, health insurance is a tough one. That's really where you want to well, I'm buying time with this answer, but so if you think about how much you have saved up, and then you can start making estimates about health. Now, obviously, we start getting into cases such as long-term care, memory care, which is extremely expensive. That's a little bit tougher to actually project because you don't know how much care you'll need. Actually, in the last month's journal, we ran an article about long-term care insurance. And a lot of people wrote in the comments section about whether or not it's worth having it because whether or not you'll need it. And we know from medical expenses from studies, a lot of people, it's not as severe as people worry, but then there's this tail that really has high expenses. And we never know for sure when we're retiring if we're going to be in that upper quadrant that has some very high expenses. So that's when you start making some guesses about how much of your wealth you might need later in life. And you need to start accounting for that in your portfolio plan. Now, you can look at your parents, you can look at your family, and if there's been a risk, say, of some type of debilitating disease, whether it's Alzheimer's, dementia, perhaps cancer, something else, or perhaps you know your own health situation, and perhaps you know you're at a higher risk of needing assisted care or even more higher level care on top of that, then you can start building it into your spending plans and realize that you might have to spend a larger amount of your wealth. And it may even require doing some budget assumptions. One thing I do with my mother-in-law that people might find helpful is I actually have a spreadsheet actually planning out how much she could spend throughout, well into her 90s. And I'm making assumptions, okay, if she spends X amount, how long will her money last? And fortunately, she's well below what I budgeted, so she's doing great. But the idea is at least gives me an idea of, okay, if her spending gets to X level above it, then I know I need to stop and reassess. But I know as long as she's below that level, things are doing well. And it really is nothing. It's nothing complicated. It's really what's she getting in income, how much she's spending, and then I'm literally assuming no growth in our portfolio. So I'm being really conservative. And every year I'm just updating it to see how she's doing. So that's the type of exercise somebody's worried about perhaps later in life care. They could perhaps walk through that scenario, and it might at least give them a guideline to assess how they're doing. When you get to a review process, maybe once a year you take a look at it. Is my spending still below my budgeted level? If it is, great. If not, then I need to reassess my allocation and perhaps reassess how I'm investing.
This is, I guess, perhaps along the line of emergency funds. So any thoughts on the establishment of an emergency fund? Any suggestions as to, how much, do you set aside X number of years of funds in advance and have that available to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually used that in one of our examples. I didn't use it here. I wanted to simplify things. But one of the examples I used in terms of talking about goals was a millennial named Liz. And we assumed she was right out of college, had credit card debt, college loans. We also assumed she had little savings. And we made her first goal building up the savings. And so we do think having those savings is utmost important. Even in lifetime strategies, Jim Cloonan is a big proponent of having stocks, really advocated for your goal number one is having those emergency savings. Now, how much should you have as emergency savings? It varies a lot. Financial advisors, it seems a common rule is 6 months to a year if you're working. And then if you're retired, you may want to really think about between 2 to approximately 5 years in cash or very short-term investments, short-term bonds, T-bills, CDs. And now I've seen that as low as 1, and I've seen people go up to 6 or 7 years. But I think Jim Cloonan's suggestion of 4 years, I would say you can even go up to 5 years. I don't think Jim would disagree with me too much, because the idea is usually over most 5-year periods, the market's usually up, and it gives you enough time to bounce back from our portfolio. But the big way to think about this, and it might help people, and you can find this in the AAII Journal, Vanguard did a study of withdrawals, and they found that during bear markets, the less you can actually spend, the better off you are. So flipping the picture, the less you can take out of your stock investments, the better you can do, the better off you'll be. So that might help think about your cash bucket. So again, in very simple terms, if you're retired, think about 4 to 5 years of cash that you can withdraw from so you don't have to sell stocks. And if you're working, think about 6 months to a year. And that time frame really depends on how stable your job is and how exposed your job is to the economy and to economic fluctuations.
Well, you've got probably quite a few slides to go through yet, so we'll save some more questions for the end.
That sounds good. Thanks, John. Okay, now I want to go through some of the things about the AAII Way. We have not fully developed, but it'll give you a sense as to where we're going with this and give you a little bit more color on some of the boxes and give you a sense of some of the details we're going to be filling in. So say Bob and Jane has figured out their risk tolerance, they've decided on their allocation. What other decisions do they have to make, and what other decisions will we help them decide? Well, one of the key things is, do they want to invest the money? Do they want to manage their own investments? If they do want to manage their investments, do they want to use an active approach where maybe they're doing it? Or do they prefer indexing? And then, do they want to pick their own securities, or do they want to use an active manager? So the idea is really, when it comes down to preferences, your first question is, do you want to manage your portfolio? Do you want to have an advisor do it? Or do you want to blend? For some people, they want some semblance of control. They want an advisor using some of it. Some people might want that sense of control, but only to the extent they want to just pick index funds. And some of you really want to roll up your sleeves and get into it, and that's fine. But I think when you're thinking about these preferences, I would also encourage you to think about your interest level and your time commitment. You might find going through financial statements to be the most boring thing in the world. If so, don't feel bad. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with using ETFs, using index funds. You might really enjoy doing investments, and just realize because of other things going in your life, you don't have time to do it. That's fine too. Adjust your portfolio, adjust your strategy accordingly. If on the other hand, you truly enjoy it and you have the time to do it, by all means do it. Again, this is really that personalization, where personalization plays a role. What are you really willing to do? What are you able to do? What are your interests? Write it down, and don't try to be a type of investor that you're not. And it varies, and you can be a blend of this, where maybe you use an advisor for certain things, index funds for certain things, and you manage a portion of your portfolio yourself. There's really no correct range on the spectrum that's right for every person. Now, let's say Bob and Jane want to self-manage. They want to be in control. Well, I would say if this is the case, they should have clear buy and sell rules like we do with our portfolios, like our dividend investing portfolio, our stock superstars portfolio, our shadow stock portfolio. If instead they're using mutual funds, or they're using ETFs, they'll need to watch the funds. They'll need to match funds to the portfolio allocations. If you're using actively managed portfolios, or if they're using index funds, they want to keep an eye on the objectives. And what I'll say with the index funds, keep an eye on the index they're following, and make sure they don't shift the indexes. Vanguard famously did it a few years ago. And I can't say it's happening with ETFs, but it's possible you could see a change in the objectives. So just keep an eye on it. Now, if they want to buy individual stocks, then you should think about the rules. Are they going to look at the valuation? Are they going to look at earnings? Are they going to look at the business model? So instead of saying, oh, Jim Cramer's saying buy this stock, really have a plan for saying, I'm going to look for a stock with these specific traits, and I'm going to check these certain things on the stock to make sure it actually is an attractive stock for my investment strategy. Now, that we also want them to be involved in monitoring their investments. We want them to regularly watch their investments, and not every day. In fact, there's really no reason to watch what your investments are doing on a day-by-day basis. In fact, you really shouldn't, because it might cause you to sell too frequently. We found you can successfully look at your portfolio once a week or even less. Our model shadow stock portfolio, which has worked really well over the long term, gets analyzed once a quarter. So you can really get by analyzing investments less than you realize, but you should still have a frequency. Regardless if it's, once a week, you only look at night, you only look on the weekends, or maybe look once a month. Whatever frequencies works well for you, have that written down and have a plan for what you're going to look at. And it shouldn't be so much price change unless you're using technical analysis, but more the factors that are tied to your buy and sell decisions. But I would also encourage them to periodically assess their risk tolerance. Has something changed in their life? Has something changed in their family? And really getting down to these life changes. Is there a new child? Did one of their children get a divorce? Something that happened, and actually we want them to analyze their portfolio. And one thing I would encourage you, if there's been a big change in your life, whether it's a life stage event in your life, you're retired, something happened with your family, it's a good time to actually go back through all your estate documents. Who you have listed as beneficiaries on your accounts, your will, your estate documents. Are they still up to date, and does something need to change on them? Because it's very easy to overlook and all of a sudden get to the point where something has changed that you need to change those documents, but you haven't changed. And if you don't change them before the time they kick in, they could kick in with that one aspect that you really wanted to change. And the reason why we're having Bob and Jane think through all these things and do all these things is they get to have this policy statement guiding what they do. So we want to start them off with thinking about their goals and what they are and who they are as investors, then picking their allocation, then thinking about, okay, how am I going to invest? Am I going to be active, or am I going to have somebody help me out? Then decide what instruments they're going to invest in, how, the rules they're going to use to analyze investments, and finally the review process. So when they walk away, they go through all this process from really the top to the bottom. They're going to have these set of guidelines for making all their investment process. And they'll have this systematic process. So by the time we have this fully developed out, you're going to be able to do something similar for yourself and actually have this setup, and you're going to be able to customize it for your own needs. So you'll be able to actually know what you need to do when something in your life happens or when something with the market goes crazy. It'll give you that psychological comfort of knowing you have a plan, what you need to do. And then another added benefit for Bob and Jane is that they'll be able to articulate what they're doing to their children. What do they want to teach their grandchildren? They'll be able to go to them and say, here's what they're doing. And the reason why I say this is particularly for those of you who are older. What if something unexpectedly happened to you and you can no longer manage your own investments? Would the people you trust be able to step in and make the decisions you want them to make? And I'm going to invoke Warren Buffett. Several years ago, in his letter to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders, of which I'm one, he wrote, the instructions for my executor are to take the money I'm leaving to my wife, put 90% of it in an index fund, I recommend Vanguard, and 10% in cash. And I think if Buffett thought it was that important to leave those instructions for his executor, that other people should consider doing the same. It makes the people you trust, and perhaps it's your children, it makes it easier for them to step in on your behalf and make the decisions you'd want them to make. And so if you have this document, you can actually share it with them. And if you have younger children, it's actually a good way to help them get involved, get them interested in saying, here's what I'm doing. Let me show you what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. And you actually give them a good basis to learn about how to invest. So there is an added benefit outside your own portfolio that you could use this for. Now, again, I want you to help us watch us building this. We're early in the process of creating this, and we're going to keep rolling this out and revising it based on feedback that we get from members. You can see what we're doing on my investor update email. It comes out every Thursday. You can go here, aai.com/investor-update. And if you want to get straight to your email, you'll see a subscribe button on there. That'll take you to our email center where you can actually control which AI emails you want to get and which ones perhaps you don't want to get. You can also go to aai.com/AAII Way. This is where we actually have the worksheets we've created with added commentaries about those worksheets. So some discussion on AI, on Investor Update, and more on AI Way. And we are actually tagging those investor updates, the ones specific to the AI Way, so you can actually access them on that AAII Way page. You can also see things that we're doing in the AI Journal. As I said, last month's investor graphic, this month's investor graphic are actually tied to the AI Way. So again, we're actually want to integrate this with all aspects of AI.com membership. And again, my investor update, here's what I talked about last week to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Last week, I talked about stock returns. I actually provided some historical data on what various types of stocks have done. International, small cap, emerging. If you scroll down the commentary, you'll actually see tables. And I'll be doing a similar table tomorrow, talking about long-term bonds, short-term bonds, muni bonds. You'll see a similar table. I'll also be talking about interest rate risk. And giving you a table talk about interest rate sensitivity for those of you who are interested. And again, we want this to be useful for you. We want you to use this. So take what we've developed so far, try it out, send us an email at journal@ai.com. If you want to reach me directly, I have one of the simplest emails in the world. It's simply charles@aai.com. Either email will get to me directly. And again, we want you to use this, and we want your feedback so we can make it even more usable for you. So John, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if additional members have questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
How much time would you like to devote to questions here, Charles?
I'm not even looking at the clock right now, so maybe we'll give about 10 or 15 minutes. Okay we'll do about Yeah, 10, 15 more
Sounds good.
minutes.
Thank you, Charles. So,
Sure.
when talking about things like a second home, um, would that be considered part of an investment portfolio? How would you account for real estate? Is it part of the
I
equity
think,
part?
yeah, it's a good question. If you're doing it as an investment, um, then it's quasi equity, it's quasi cash flow because it depends on how stable you think that cash flow is. If you think it's risky, the development property, that'd be more equity. If you have long-term renters, or perhaps, I live in Texas, so a lot of people have mineral rights or water rights. Then it might be more of a cash flow aspect to it. So it really falls in between those. But I think if it's a home that you're living in, I think from that standpoint, I think you're really wanting to get outside your portfolio because then it really is a cash flow expense where you have to think about your property taxes, you have to think about your upkeep. So I wouldn't treat it so much as an asset in terms of investing as more as really a cost standpoint. Even though it is an asset, it's something you can ultimately pass to your heirs. Should be part of your estate planning, but I would argue in that case, perhaps leave it out of your portfolio planning and treat it more as an expense you have to maintain.
In the context of financial tolerance, are dividends considered portfolio income? You don't necessarily need to sell them if you're generating enough income through dividends.
Correct. So they count as portfolio income, but it's still an equity investment. So even though you're getting income from them, and it might actually help provide enough cash flow for you, in the tolerance, in a sheet, we're actually talking about non-portfolio income. So it really is money you're getting from Social Security, pensions, annuities if you have it. Again, perhaps you have some other stream of income that's coming in that's not from typical investments. Perhaps you're getting royalties from something. Those type of things. Dividends are really equity investments. And even though dividend stocks tend to be less volatile, they're still stocks and they still can incur huge drops in value and sometimes, in fact, bigger drops in price than you'll actually get from dividend income.
I see nothing about taxes, and the gentleman considers that to be a major concern. Any thoughts as far as how that factors into the whole planning process?
Well, I do think it's a tactic, and I think when it comes down to how you're going to, in terms of what securities you actually invest in, for instance, you look at your bond allocation, then you might start thinking about, okay, I want to allocate to bonds, and that's when you start getting to, do I want to look at muni bonds? You also, I think, when you start getting to tactics about how you're actually going to buy your investments, then we can start getting into the concept about asset location. And so asset location is different than diversification. So diversification is your stocks, your bonds, your cash. Asset location is really where you're going to locate certain investments. So if you have a very active strategy that involves maybe use technical analysis, a lot more trading, that's when you start thinking about, okay, as part of my strategy, I need to have that located in my IRAs and other tax preferred accounts versus my municipal bonds. That's why I want to have it in my taxable account. So it really is a tactic that comes into when you're selecting securities and what type of account you're going to hold in securities versus your allocation decision is how much I'm going to have in stocks, how much I'm going to have in bonds, how much I'm going to have in cash.
But if I recall correctly, you're planning on covering those topics, but in a different part of the overall way, right? The whole tactical part, whether you do funds or stocks or elements of that nature.
Yes, absolutely.
This is more of an observation than really a question. Harry sees the body like a machine. Over time, if it doesn't rust out, it will wear out. Therefore, healthcare costs and insurance will consume a larger portion of your expenses as you age. So it's, I guess you have to think about that as far as your costs as you get older.
Healthcare costs. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that you need to factor in as you're retired. And as I said, I've done some budgeting for my mother-in-law. And one thing I would suggest to people who are worried about, who are concerned about it, if you're living by yourself, it may not be a bad idea to just go visit some, retirement communities by you, visiting some independent, some assisted living, and some long-term care facilities, and just talk to them. How much are you charging? And what are you actually doing in terms of cost? What type of inflation should I budget into it? And you can start playing that out. Okay, perhaps at this point I might need it. And that might help you in terms of making some of these decisions about allocation. And perhaps that's one of your goals, that eventually you think you might need it and how much you might need to actually to cover it.
During retirement, if one keeps a cash budget to cover 4 years of living expenses, are additional bonds recommended for the average retiree?
It's interesting. Jim Cloonan, our founder, said it's not, but I do think it depends on your spending, how much you're dependent on your portfolio, how much income you have separate of that, and also your tolerance for risk. Jim's shown when he did his level 3 approach that if you have up to 4 years of cash and a very aggressive allocation to stocks, you can actually get through retirement with just that. But it does require you to have the psychological tolerance to actually do it. So Jim outlined a very aggressive way of doing it. And so for people with a risk tolerance, Jim's research shows that yes, you can actually do it. But not everybody has that tolerance from a psychological standpoint to do it. So that comes into understanding your own personality and considering what you've done in past down markets.
Let's see here. I recently retired and have 40% of my assets in cash and intend to invest in fixed incomes. Right now, bonds have very low interest rates. Any thoughts on what one should do in a low interest rate environment? And will your investor update tomorrow cover some of those ideas?
I will talk a little bit about. I am addressing a low interest rate. I did talk about this actually while I was writing. I was trying to go through mentally what I wrote today. One of the things, if you're concerned about interest rates, one of the things you could do is actually hold individual bonds or defined maturity bond funds. Now these defined maturity bond funds, they mature on a set date. And so the idea is you buy them with different maturities and you offset the interest rate risk. You could buy mutual funds. Over the short term, you will be subject to the impact should interest rates rise. When they rise, not a question of if, at some point they should rise. We don't know if it'll start being in 2022. We don't know if it's going to be further out. But as interest rates rise, mutual funds should reset their portfolios. So you should be getting more income from them to help offset the decrease. So really, it comes down to a question of control. Do you want to get involved with actually buying individual bonds or not? If not, but you're concerned about the rise in interest rates, you could actually use the defined maturity bond funds to ladder your interest rate exposure, which will help negate some of it. So you're buying in different increments, reinvesting it. And I'll actually have a link to an article discussing those. You can learn more about them. Or you could actually buy mutual funds and realize there is going to be periods when interest rates rise that these mutual funds will have periods of underperformance, but the fund managers should reset their portfolio, giving you more income, and over time that should even out.
An observation here, so stocks, mid caps, small caps, value especially have gone through a period of underperformance. Growth has really come on strong, especially some of the big tech stocks. So how do you handle that kind of environment, that situation, when it comes to setting up your asset allocation today?
So with our aggressive and our moderate allocations, if you look at what we do actually on our site, we actually suggest that people hold a variety of different assets. So our aggressive allocation, if you look at the way it is right now, AAII.com/asset allocation, I believe I get the link correct. We'll put it in the show notes. But we actually have people basically even amounts into large, mid, small, and then international with a smaller portion to emerging. So we're actually suggesting people spread it apart. Now, value particularly, over the last couple of years, it's really gotten its teeth kicked in. But when everyone's looking at how well large caps have done over the last 10 years, and really since the financial crisis, it's been because of a small number of growth stocks have really driven it. But investors tend to have short memories, and everyone forgets that if you go to 2000, 2009, that was a lost decade. And while small cap and mid cap stocks did really well, the S&P 500 lost money over that decade. It was down about almost a full percentage point. So if you assume the S&P 500 is still going to be the dominant index going forward, it has to assume that large cap stocks are going to keep doing well. And when you start looking at the market capitalizations of Apple, Microsoft, for them to have that stellar growth requires really a tremendous amount. And I tend to believe in what's known as a reversion to the mean, and that over the long term, the averages play out. Meaning, if you're playing roulette, and you see the ball land on black 8 times in a row, sooner or later, it's going to go back to landing on red. Now, do we know when? No, but I do think we're starting seeing that pendulum swing. And one way you can actually take advantage of what's happening now, but also positioning yourself for when that pendulum does swing, is not be solely allocated to large cap stocks, but really hold a variety of stocks, because we do think small cap, and particularly small cap value, is going to make a comeback. My crystal ball is just not good enough to tell you exactly when.
So it sounds like what you're saying then is, and it kind of almost goes back to the beginning of your presentation, is that once you have a plan, be it an asset allocation, and assuming it's appropriate for your risk tolerance, as certain asset classes get outside of the range, you rebalance, either by, if you're in a capital accumulation phase, you might invest fresh capital in those segments that are underweighted. If you're pulling money out of your portfolio, you might at that point in time try to sell out some of the capital allocation elements that are overweighted. Is that what you kind of saying there?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if you start seeing your allocation getting off kilter, that's exactly what you do. And I'm a big proponent of rebalancing. So absolutely. So yeah, if you see your small cap getting to be too small relative to your allocation, now might be a good time to perhaps consider taking money out of large caps. Now, I'm not saying do it tomorrow, but if you see your portfolio off what it should be, that's a prompt to rebalance it. And you can use bands to say 5% off target or 10% off target, because investing is messy and you don't want to constantly rebalance, but you do want to have part of your plan being, at this interval, I'm going to review my portfolio and adjust it as necessary.
And we've run out of time here, but I have one last statement here, or more of a comment that someone here has put in. Charles, I think you're doing a great job here. I'm retired and living the dream because I had a plan to save money to fund my retirement, pay off debt, etc. If people would follow your process, they'd achieve what they need. So I think that's the truth is in the pudding there. And if you have time for one more question, is that okay?
Absolutely.
It's going to be personal though, because
okay.
Well, if you're like me, I think, and you are, because you are Charles and I are both shareholders of the Green Bay Packers. We're both football team owners here, both own a share. And I just got my proxy statement in the mail this week, and I was disappointed to hear that they're not going to hold a in-person meeting. So are we going to be joining them online coming up in July? And if so, you're going to vote the proxies the way they recommend?
Well, I think, I can't wait for that proxy that allows us to actually get Aaron Rodgers to come to Chicago. So I haven't looked at the proxy statement, but if it's not in there, I might have to go online and rant a little bit, because I think here in Chicago, we could use Rodgers.
I agree with you completely. With that, I know you're going to be back in that same chair next Wednesday. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the webinar you'll be doing next week?
Sure, and absolutely. And this goes back to someone who asked a second ago about how value in small caps is done. I'm going to talk about our VMQ stocks portfolio, really about being an active investor and the type of strategies you want to follow if you want to be an active investor. I'm going to use VMQ. I'm going to explain to you why you might actually want to use factors. I know Wayne Thorpe talked about factors last week, but the idea is, if you really want to be a truly active investor, you want to think about investing different than the market. And one way you can do that is actually by using strategies that other people aren't, but are based on academic research that have shown a long-term return benefit to doing that process.
Well, thank you. And I guess in a week after that, July 15th, Wayne Thorpe will be here. He's the editor of the Stock Superstars Report, and he'll be discussing one of the approaches. And specifically, it's going to be value investing with a twist. And my recollection is that follows David Dreeman's approach. So Again, as a reminder, we have recorded the session tonight. Tomorrow you will receive an email from us with links to the recording, as well as the slides that were used tonight and any kind of mentions that were made, any kind of show notes. So thank you very much. Have a safe evening. And Charles, you want to say anything to our members before we sign off tonight?
Just thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe. And to remember that made that last comment, I just want to say, I think all of us here at the office love hearing those success stories. I'm glad you reached your goals. I think that's great. It always brings a smile to our face when we hear those stories.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.